Tom, welcome back to the Art of Supply.
Great to be with you, Kelly.
Now, I've just reshared a conversation you and I had back in the fall for people that are following the show. But for people who didn't meet you when I released that conversation or are just catching up with the show now, can you share a little bit about your background and focus, just as sort of context for the conversation we're going to have today?
Yeah, certainly. I'm coming to you today from Rocky Top, Tennessee, the University of Tennessee in beautiful Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm a professor of supply chain management here at UT Knoxville. I also serve as the Dean and Jimmy Haslam Chair in Logistics, and also co-executive director of the Global Supply Chain Institute that's housed at the Haslam College of Business at UT Knoxville.
Now, when you and I last spoke, and we had a really good time, clearly good enough that you were willing to come back,
That's
you
right.
had actually mentioned that based on the shifts we've seen in supply chain over the last few years, that it would be worth having a conversation somewhat in defense of just in time. Now, that's just in time in the sense of manufacturing, inventory management, and all of the things that go along with that. To set the stage, is just in time something that still has a place in today's operations?
Certainly. And again, I really appreciate having the opportunity to be back with you and your listeners at the Art of Supply. And yes, back when we were talking about many broad scope supply chain issues and kind of recounting the experiences of, say the past 5 years, pre-pandemic, through pandemic, and life beyond it, into the modern era, that's still marked with considerable tumults and chaos.
Yeah.
I think it is rather poignant, worthwhile for us to talk about just in time. And just a little bit of clarification, I think, for all of us, is that just in time certainly has been thrown under the bus a lot. It was blamed for all those empty shelves as we went through
Yeah.
particularly the early days of pandemic, and then it continued to be blamed for shortages more in a business to business context once we got deeper into the throes of pandemic. And we had not just the Alpha variant that came along, but Delta and Omicron that really hamstrung our global supply chains. And just in time is considered a pillar of lean thinking. And I will say that there are circumstances in which just in time may not find good or ready application in a modern supply chain context. That said, I think the balance of lean thinking very much does belong. If you think about lean thinking as its essence is about process mastery in my mind,
Mm.
and understanding the capabilities and yes, the limitations of your processes, both the micro processes that might reside within a manufacturing facility or distribution facility or retailer or hospital. But then the macro aspect takes us into the broader supply chain, or the extended value stream, as lean thinkers call it. And I'll just have to go back, I believe, to the words of Womack and Jones in what we often regard as the Bible of lean thinking, the book by that title that came out in 1993, Lean Thinking by Womack and Jones. And somewhere after page 100, there was some suggestion that lean and oceans don't mix. And of course, if we think
Yeah.
what's happened over the last 3 decades and change, as we have offshored more of our operations and extended our supply chains, if we go back to the roots of lean thinking, it would suggest, listen, if we're just trying to take the inventory out of the system, we're very likely to experience a shipwreck. And lo and behold, I think that's what happened when we overstressed our supply chains through
Yeah.
pandemic. And dare I say, it's coming under scrutiny again with tariffs. And I'm sure we'll talk more about the current circumstance. But kind of conventional lean thinking, it's funny to say conventional lean thinking, but old school lean thinking, if you will, was kind of not designed for supply chains that stretched around the world. And we're introduced to the vagueness and vagaries of very long lead times, those transits that anything can happen
Yeah.
on the big ocean, and then of course a whole host of challenges that we've experienced, pandemic and otherwise, in our supply chain. So I just want to make that little distinction that I think lean thinking can and should be applied to every enterprise on the planet. I think there's goodness there to master the processes and understand what you can reliably count on. Where a lot of folks got it wrong, though, is that they took the inventory out of those supply chain systems because we'd only experienced very narrow tolerances up to that time. But lo and behold, a pandemic comes along and it hamstrings us, takes us to our knees, and our supply chain systems couldn't stand up. Now, with regard to the second part of your question, just in time, I do feel has some place when you have high performing, reliable process.
Yeah.
And that might mean that you have a supplier campus situation where you have an assembly operation and tier one suppliers that are on a campus co-located nearby. And you can very readily then feed, say, components that will then be assembled into final products in that kind of close proximity and close time. In which case, it's still a worthwhile supply chain strategy because you'll hold those components with far less risk and cost than you will hold finished goods.
Yeah.
Because those finished goods are far more valuable, far more risky because they're in their final form, dedicated, and very difficult to change the final form of a product once it's determined. Meanwhile, components can go into any number of configurations and uses. And so it's still a worthwhile supply chain strategy. And so I'm even going to defend just in time, but wholeheartedly to the defense of lean thinking.
Well, and I think it's interesting because when you talk about it as process mastery, I think that was the phrase that you used. It's interesting because a lot of things change with time. To your point about supply chain distances becoming longer, oceans playing a part in a greater number of those supply chains. If we truly were focused on the process mastery, somebody would have caught, if we extend this supply chain, these logistics, not just over this distance, but include an ocean in it, if you are actively engaged in that process mastery, then the stumbles probably wouldn't have taken place. It's almost like the just-in-time or the lean thinking became so embedded in the way we do things that we stopped thinking about the changes in our other strategies and tactics that were going to cause it to stumble. And so now it's like we need to go back and say, no, we're not going to reject it everywhere. But it's bringing that active thought to actually achieve that process mastery that I think keeps just-in-time or lean thinking on the table. How did we not notice that all of the other changes we were making were going to push lean thinking to the brink?
Well, and I'll just point out a lot of these decisions were not made by supply chain professionals.
Totally fair.
They kind of said, hey, I'm kind of intrigued by this lean thinking thing. And a lot of CFOs said, you mean I can reduce the inventory investment? Or we can push that burden upstream in the supply chain? Tell me more. But I think we kind of lost their interest once we got into the operational jargon that we inevitably get into when we talk about how this would actually work. And so there was, big eyes and excitement, enthusiasm around the potential outcomes, but the hard work that it takes to maybe get that, achieve it, and sustain that kind of high performing, reliable, stable process is something that got lost in there. And there's no doubt that we've got these two kind of conflicting forces at work, this notion of everything that lean brings to the table with respect for people. And in fact, if you go back to those early days of lean thinking, it was a way to try to onshore more operations, right? It was the suggestion that we need to be competitive as a manufacturing country in the United States. And it really has proven helpful to kind of retrench what manufacturing we do have in this country and try to make it competitive on a global basis, despite having considerably higher wages and cost of doing business than we experience around the world. But we do enjoy much greater certainty around the lead times, the quality, the integrity of the product, and the integrity of the process as well, because we don't have to shine bright lights into far off distant corners of the supply chain and wonder what the heck is going on in tier 2, 3, 4, 5 if we've got greater control of the process. So that was really much of the impetus And I think, again, there's hard work. It
Oh,
takes a lot of
absolutely.
discipline, and there's no short, easy pathway to lean success and sustained success. And I think that's where we decided, all right, the other force that's at work is this low cost country sourcing stuff. And it affords a lot of room for error if you have this huge arbitrage
Yeah.
in labor. And as we know, you and I, Kelly, as supply chain professionals, that arbitrage has been closing certainly over the years as the cost of doing business in low-cost countries has also continued to rise. But I don't think that most folks understood a concept we talked about in our last conversation that comes to bear: total cost of ownership.
Yeah.
And your listeners to Art of Supply are knowledgeable, perhaps practicing professionals around total cost of ownership that says, hey, it goes way beyond the purchase price of that material component or even the finished good. We're concerned about the full life cycle of those materials, components, and finished goods. And if we're procuring low cost inputs, we're going to have some measure of hell to pay down the road. And over time, we've come to bear that. And dare I say, pandemic really took that notion to bear.
Well, and it's interesting too, because you bring up the connection between lean thinking or just in time, and then of course, reshoring, which is something that's been completely thrust back into the news headlines recently with the increased tariffs, either around approaching something closer to trade parity, or simply trying to bring more manufacturing back to the United States. And it's interesting because for all of the companies that you hear about scrambling or trying to figure out alternate plans, or how are they going to handle the added costs of tariffs, especially as they've been a bit back and forth, we're also starting to read stories now about companies who say, yeah, we saw the writing on the wall and we started to change this years ago. We didn't like the unpredictability. We didn't like the variability. We were concerned that something like this might happen. And so for some companies, maybe not the majority, but for some that are very well placed right now, they started going through all of this potentially even decades ago in preparation for exactly the conditions that we're in right now. And so maybe some of the changes that the tariffs are intended to drive will sort of bring that lean thinking back into these strategy sessions as something to be at least considered in each case.
No, you're right. Again, where so many individual companies and then entire industries made the leap to low-cost country sourcing, namely China. Let's go ahead and call that out. And so many companies leapt before they looked, right? And something we talked about in our previous podcasts was the China price. Where some very powerful US-based companies said, if you want to be competitive, you might need to lower that price, many tens of percentage points, basis points where it is now. And, your competitors are looking at China, perhaps setting up shop there. And so you might want to do the same. And inevitably, so many companies then followed suit. And, but you're right, though, there has been some turning of the tide. And I'm keen to point out to listeners that sometimes maybe have a short memory. And I'm guilty of that myself. And I have to think back to Trump 1.0, in the first term when he did introduce tariffs in early 2018. And that led many companies to think China +1, +2. And that really kind of feeds into what my friends in finance have been telling me for years. Hey, Goldsby, you need to diversify. Right? And when it comes to sources of supply in terms of countries and companies even, it's probably not wise to put all eggs in one basket. And those folks that have failed to diversify over the last, they've had 7 years actually, right, to do that, then they're probably feeling more vulnerable than the rest, the folks that have been looking for alternative sources of supply, and yes, even entertaining reshoring where it makes sense. But of course, that's the likes of Vietnam and Cambodia and India and Mexico and Thailand and Latin America and a whole host of places have been entertained by pretty savvy companies now for the better part of 7 years, and now everyone is looking for that point of diversification.
So there's theory and then there's practice, right? And oftentimes we hear a lot of talk that doesn't actually end up materializing in any company's strategies. But do you think we're at the place where beyond talk, companies are starting to actively factor lean thinking, just-in-time inventory management back into their practices? Or are we not quite there yet from either a confidence or just a change management basis?
And again, I'll probably go back to the two different broad variants of lean thinking, right? There's the lean theory, which again, I espouse and remain every bit a believer in now as I was 25 years ago. And then there's the lean in practice and the conventional ways that lean has been looked toward as the inventory minimization strategy. And let's speak of that one first. And there seems to be a pendulum swinging in terms of its vogue fashion quotient in that, I've been listening to earnings calls quite a bit over the last 5 years. And, when companies were so desperate for that inventory, and that's when JIT and lean thinking in total were being thrown under the bus routinely. And so let's get away from all that. Our lean supply chains got us in this mess was kind of the common, mass media sort of response to the situation, treating things at the symptom level. And lo and behold, supply chains did ultimately catch up. It might have taken into 2022, 2023 before things kind of settled down. And then you start listening to those earnings calls from that time, and the CFO started speaking up saying, we're way too heavy on inventory. Yes, we were desperate for that inventory before, but now we want to implement that lean thinking. Tell me more about that lean thinking. And it was all about, again, lightening the balance sheet of the inventory and other working assets and capital. So that aspect is a bit of a pendulum swing. However, if you believe, if you're a lean purist like me, like I like to think I am, again, process mastery, problem solving. Think about how important that aspect of lean thinking, problem solving, everyday problem solving is. If you had an organization that was filled front to back, top to bottom with problem solvers, and they spoke a common language and had common methods for solving problems, how worthwhile would that be right now when we're seeing grand fluctuations in the business situation? It's not even day to day, right? It's practically minute to minute.
It is.
So I would want my organization full of these problem solvers that, big or small, are ready to go to work, get their hands dirty, and actually, as we were sharing in our previous podcast, create advantage out of the chaos. And that's what we're really keen to study here at the University of Tennessee, are those companies that are not just going to weather the storm and absorb the disruption, but there's tremendous opportunities for those individuals, those companies, those supply chains that can kind of figure out things a little sooner than the rest and become then the model for others to follow. They're going to enjoy a huge advantage. And then by the time those folks catch up to the leader, the leader's already moved on to the next, right? Because they're loaded, they're laden with these problem solvers.
And none of this is operations in a vacuum, right? It's always about either creating shareholder value or creating value for customers. So if we were to say, we don't want to just optimize our supply chains for resilience or for efficiency, right, or for speed, we actually want to redesign our supply chain so that we are creating customer value. If we put that at the heart of that process mastery, what are some of the things that we might see change?
Well, I love that you pointed that out, right? I mean, even to this point in the conversation, we've been talking about kind of doing the right things right.
Yes.
And a lot of folks will focus on the back part of that, doing things right. But the right things are defined based upon what the customer is dictating. And that's the very first premise of lean thinking, going back to Womack and Jones again, the classic. It said, define value in the eyes of customers. And just as soon as you think you figure that out, the customer's probably moved on to the next iteration, right? And so it's an ongoing, ever-present sort of journey. And we're trying to figure out, again, virtually minute to minute, what's going to make that customer tick. But I do have great faith in the fact that the companies that are using advanced tools that are available to us artificial intelligence, yes,
Mm,
to structure the unstructured data to make sense of the chaos to the extent that you can make sense of that chaos and then act on it and get to that customer, whether it's a business customer, government customer, consumer like you and me, and is still that quality in the eyes of the customers. Hey, that's again the company I want to work for. That's the company I want to send my students to go work for.
yeah.
It's a company I want to invest in, right? And so I think that's still the name of the game. And I love that mantra again, doing the right things right. And again, the right things are changing all the time. And yes, it also means doing things with integrity.
Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, I think that still counts for something, that we don't rely on forced labor, conflict minerals, and unsavory business practice and partners to get that job done.
Because even to make a consumer happy, to your point, preferences are changing all of the time. It does still have to be at a competitive price point. It does still have to be made ethically. No brand wants their name or logo associated with a questionable business practice. So really, in order to be successful in terms of customer value, you're trying to satisfy all of these things at the same time. Now, if you're lucky enough to have this building full of problem solvers, they're actually probably happy because that's job certainty for them, or job security, gives them something to do, keeps them out of trouble. But for most companies, they would rather get to a place of a little more stability, right? Yes, we understand we're going to have to keep tweaking our strategies or diversify in different ways, but how we think about how frequently these strategies and processes have to be adjusted are we in something of a time where we almost need to be like micro strategy, where we're constantly looking for signs and tweaking things versus allowing ourselves to get back to that place where, as we were saying earlier, lean thinking almost became absent-mindedly embedded in our strategies and we forgot to think about what it was going to ask of us. How can we stay more mindful with all of these changes that our strategies have to succeed in?
Well, Kelly, it's almost like you're reading my mind. I've been working on getting some thoughts down that I've not yet shared with the world broadly anyway, and you're already tapping into them, the notions of micro and macro agility. And micro agility is within your direct realm of control. That could be applied at the individual level, the work level. It could be at your organization level, within the four walls, however you want to define that span of control that you enjoy. Pretty much discretion. I don't want to say complete discretion, but
Sure.
you enjoy a great deal of discretion about how emphases are placed, strategy is determined, and execution is determined. And so that's the micro aspect. And then the macro really takes us beyond the organization. And we do start to lose degrees of control, certainly in that end-to-end supply chain notion. But it doesn't mean that we should be helpless. And how do we do that? Again, we are ever aware of our circumstance and the changes in that circumstance. And then we're actively looking to manage that circumstance. I think anyone right now that's just kind of taking these tariffs lying down, it's like you're doing yourself and your organization a grave injustice, right? You got to change the options that are on the table, and you've got to be trying to, again, look for that advantage that's perhaps out there. And so this notion of micro and macro, and I think it's not an either or proposition, right? I think that you have to be active in both regards. And there's a term that myself and a good friend of mine, Walter Zen at Ohio State University, we coined about 6-7 years ago called plasticity. So thanks for letting me drop that term on your audience, but it's really agility applied to supply chain configurations. And a lot of times, we find that, those are maybe changes that you can make over a quarter or 6 months or a year or a longer period of time. But, we're being asked to make those kinds of changes in real time, virtually. And so it's not an either or proposition when it comes to, managing those things, that are within hand's reach and those things that are well beyond the reach. We're having to try to understand and choreograph to the greatest extent possible in both the near and broad term.
And hopefully we've all learned something, right? Because I think about our hypothetical CFO friend in this situation, right? Who was very excited. Yeah, tell me about this lean thinking that's going to take all of these inventory costs out of my system, right? Okay, well, if you get really, really good at that and something goes wrong, now you have nothing to sell, which is typically bad for the top line, right? Not great for business. And so, okay, now there's this panic to bring the inventory back in. But then by the time we figured it out, there was a lot of mismatching and a lot of this inventory had to be written down. Has either supply chain or finance, individually or better together, have we learned from the past few years not to let that pendulum go too far in either direction? I guess I'm wondering if you had a CFO and a chief supply chain officer that have both been in place at the same company for this last 5 years with all of its ups and downs, and they're starting to look at their inventory options around the tariffs. Let's stay with that theme. Are they in a place to have a different conversation with maybe a little bit different understanding on the CFO's part, maybe even a little more pushback on the chief supply chain officer's part? Have we matured around our understanding of how all of this plays out together?
Well, for one thing, I'm hopeful that the pandemic experience provided supply chain professionals, those senior supply chain leaders, with an opportunity to meet at
Yeah,
the C level, maybe assume a role within the C-suite, and then also a role facing the board routinely. And it's really invigorating for me to hear how many companies have elevated what was once a vice president of supply chain to maybe an SVP or EVP, and
yeah,
even the chief supply chain officer. And dare I say, some chief supply chain officers then moving into the
that's
CEO
right.
role. So I think that's very promising. And I sometimes use the language of, how do we turn this moment into a movement, in terms of how do we maintain our place? And sure enough, as we face tariffs right now, those senior supply chain leaders are getting that face time with the CEO, with peers in various functional areas, and yes, also with the board. One thing I think to your question though is, how we, in terms of how we leverage that and make it a movement, is challenged a little bit in that there continues to be so much, turnover and turmoil within organizations. And a statistic that I share with my students routinely, and they are shocked by this, is I ask them the question, what do you think is the median tenure for C-level executive in a Fortune 500 US-based company? And notice I was very clear to say median. So that means
Yep.
50% of the people that are going to hold those roles at the senior most levels of an organization, how long do you expect that they're going to stay in that capacity? And when I share with students that it's about 30 months, that's 2.5
Wow.
years. Okay. And so half of those folks are going to stay more than 2.5 years, and half are going to stay 2.5 years or less. And so, those are folks that if you're in that lower 50% that's having a lot of turn in the C-suite, there's not much in the way of long-term memory.
True.
And there's also, dare I say, not a lot of focus on long-term strategy and planning, right? You're thinking, okay, if I'm only in the seat for 30 months, how do I try to navigate the day-to-day, and how do I prevent having a cataclysmic circumstance on my watch? And so I think we're inherently challenged with a lot of very large US-based privately held. And you could say the same thing when you got private equity owning, and they may be looking for quicker turns than a lot of privately held companies otherwise. And so I think we're a little bit hamstrung and challenged. And I think that then leads to the pendulum swing that we were talking about, where we don't necessarily say, okay, let's come up with a 7-year strategy, knowing that the world is going to look a lot different in 2 years, let alone 7, but still just having the gumption and courage to say, let's make those big bets. Let's invest in our people. Let's invest in our technology and facilities, and let's invest in our supply chain up and down the chain. It's challenged by that inherent short-term thinking. I didn't mean to completely squeeze the air out of the balloon. That explains a lot about why it's difficult to sustain a vision and pursue it.
Absolutely. And at the very least, so I think, okay, so 30 months, And of course, everybody's not walking in and walking out on the same day. So you're every 4, 6, 8 months, right? Somebody is coming to the end of their 30 months and you've got people switching in and out. It's almost like if you really want to get to the point that you're planning and thinking and strategizing longer term, it has to be with the realization that it needs to be on a 4 to 6 month refresh cycle. Because if you're going to get through enough cycles of adjustment to make it sort of an organizational practice to think and look in this way, you have to break it down, because you can't have, well, this is Kelly's 7-year strategy, but in 2.5 years, Kelly's going to be gone and her replacement's sure as heck not going to want to look at that old deck. That's not happening.
Anytime
right?
there's a change in the guard, right? A change in the
Exactly.
general, right? They're going to go in a new direction.
Yeah. But it does also, I hear opportunity in that, right? And there's been a lot of excitement around roles in supply chain. There's been a lot of new investment in supply chain technologies and digital disruption. Even the application of AI, right, into supply chain has been huge. And so before we wrap our conversation, I actually want to give you an opportunity to talk about a new supply chain program that you've been working on. One that I know I said to you when we last spoke, if I didn't have this darn full-time and a half job, I would be signing up for this program. But with that turnover comes opportunity for new people and new perspectives to come into supply chain. So talk a little bit about that program and how you're specifically setting it up to be new and different.
Certainly. Thanks, Kelly. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our new Master of Science degree, supply chain management, dedicated to global supply chain. And it is a 1-year MS program taught here at Knoxville, our main campus, University of Tennessee. We are so excited. Since the last time I spoke with you, the program has been fully approved and we are recruiting students for our incoming class, the inaugural class in this MS Global Supply Chain program. And we're going to basically try to bring the world to Knoxville. We're going to try to create what we call the world-ready supply chain professional. And hey, I'm really proud of the product that we take to market in our undergraduate program, which you've allowed me to plug that in the past. I'm going to iterate again. It's the, or perhaps second largest major on campus. Supply chain is hip and cool here in Knoxville. UT. And we think a lot of the students are going to continue on from our undergraduate program into this master's degree. And I'm getting the question, hey, Professor Goldsby, what am I going to learn maybe from the same faculty in many cases that's distinct from what I learned during the Bachelor of Science and Supply Chain program? And I think you can appreciate this. Maybe many of your listeners can appreciate this, that I say, hey, again, I'm really proud of the product we take out in the world, but there are a couple of areas where amateurs probably shouldn't, engage too deeply. It's things like hazardous materials, right? I mean, you need deeper knowledge, expertise, certifications, education to safely handle hazmats. You can maybe say the same thing about the integrity of food products and pharmaceuticals and so forth, but also in the international domain. And I think we can all appreciate this right now, that it's not the place for amateurs to kind of learn on the job. Right? If you think about how do you clear customs? How do you pay a tariff? How do you negotiate who's going to pay that tariff? Those are the sorts of issues we're going to start taking up on day one. I joke that often in our undergraduate classes, every course has some international or global component, but it's like that chapter 12 or 13.
Of course, yeah.
Textbook, and we get toward it at the very end of the semester when we're kind of hustling to wrap things up. And it's like, oh, by the way, things are really different. As soon as you start crossing borders, the complexities are off the charts. Well, that's where we're going to start in this curriculum. And then we're also going to provide those students with an opportunity to go out and see it with international travel. They'll get some stamps on their passports and be able to see and experience not just the business of supply chain management, but the culture of supply chain management. And so how do you run a meeting in Vietnam? Right? Students are going to have an opportunity to gain that kind of experience, and we're going to squeeze it into 30 credits, 9 months. And as you can tell by my voice, I'm so excited about it. And I think our students are.
Well, it sounds like a fantastic opportunity. Tom, if people are meeting you for the first time through this conversation, would like to connect with you, maybe want to learn more about that global supply chain program, what is the best ways for them to get that information?
Sure. Well, they can reach me via email at T Goldsby, that's TGOLDSBY at utk.edu. And also find me on LinkedIn. And I'd love to follow you right back. So I'm Thomas Goldsby at LinkedIn. And that's also a great way to plug into what we're doing at the Global Supply Chain Institute, which we just had our supply chain forum event last week, over 800 attendees, just an incredible event. And so I'm really invigorated coming off of that experience. And also, I just, hey, not to compete with you, but we've got the Tennessee on Supply Chain Management podcast.
Oh, no, the more the merrier. Everybody needs to be listening to more supply chain podcasts.
We'd love to get some listeners of yours to come over and join us at Tennessee Supply Chain Management podcast that I co-host monthly with my co-host, Dr. Ted Stank.
Awesome. Well, Tom, thank you so much for being back. I think you did an excellent job defending lean thinking. It's back on the table. I am sure we will have you back again for another conversation. But until then, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise.
Thank you, Kelly. Always a pleasure to be with you and the listeners and viewers of Art of Supply.